Are you optimistic that with the new government here, with the change of government here, there will be more and more Canadian companies and investment coming in these sectors? For example, that you mentioned about mining, finance, banking,
Yep.
and what else?
Yeah. Well, mining, finance, banking. There were a lot of areas. We had there was Canadian participation at the IT sectoral show in Yangon back in I believe it was late November, and some of these small Canadian IT companies made small sales. They met with they provide IT solutions. So there are these small successes. There's also, the agricultural sector is a huge, there are a huge number of opportunities, and that's another place where Canadian and Myanmar, Canadian expertise and Myanmar needs mesh very well. Canada's an agricultural powerhouse, and things like lentils and peas that Myanmar grows, Canada grows as well. You don't think of these two countries as having something in common, but they really do. And I think there's a lot of opportunities there for Canadian technology, Canadian expertise, Canadian distribution chains, those types of technologies, hard and soft technologies. There's a lot of opportunities here. So whether I'm optimistic or not, I would say, yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic.
There are issues like regulations
Yeah.
and regulatory board.
Yeah, because
And there's no, may I understand, there's no the agreement between the two countries on foreign investment protection so far?
There is not so far, but that's something we're looking into very actively right now. So that's a possibility. But the issue is that businessmen don't invest because they think the country is nice, or because because it's an inspiring story. They invest because they think their investments will be profitable and safe. And I think there's a lot of potential for profit here, but you need that environment for it to be safe.
Yeah. You mentioned about the Canadians' commitment to human rights.
Yes.
And in supporting the human rights groups in the country that you have been very actively doing. Myanmar has been struggling with the, again, human rights issue. We have political prisoners. Hopefully some of them will be released today and tomorrow before our new year. And we have been criticized. Myanmar has been criticized on human rights situation by the United Nations and bodies. Mm-hmm. Do you expect the changes and improvement and progress in human rights in near future in Myanmar?
I do, and I think we have to give the former government some credit. I mean, it was a semi-democratic government, but a lot of progress was made under the former government, again from a very low base, but tremendous progress made. And I think this government is committed, and I hope the prisoner release is an example of it, to continuing that improvement. But human rights is not a thing that's finished, right? In affluent countries, in countries that have been democracies for 100 years, we still have to worry about human rights. There are still human rights violations. People in positions of power can act with impunity. Groups can be marginalized. There's a lot of things that can go wrong even in affluent countries. So don't think that one day you're going to be able to say, okay, we're finished. We've got perfect human rights, and it's done. So you have to be constantly vigilant. That said, I think there are a number of there's still a lot of issues here that are of great concern. There's conflict, and in conflict areas there are human rights abuses. There are all types of there's issues of inter-ethnic, intercommunal violence, which have been historically very prevalent here, that we hope are going to be on the wane and disappear. But let me give you a couple of examples of things that. These are small examples of projects that Canada has been funding for the last couple of years. So, for example, we're a great supporter of PEN Myanmar, which works hard for freedom of expression, freedom to publish, freedom to speak, and so on. And that's a freedom that's, it's under attack in many parts of the world, in countries that are much more developed than Myanmar. So it's a credit to them that their work is so, they're very professional and very active here. Another one is the Human Dignity Film Institute, which puts on the Human Rights Film Festival every year in Yangon in June. And we are a very, very proud supporter of that from the very first year. In fact, you may know the Student Film Award is named after Peter Wintonic, who's a Canadian filmmaker. So there's a tremendous Canadian connection there. We're very proud of our documentary tradition, and we're very happy to see that here there's this documentarians are becoming human rights defenders. And the other aspect of it, it's not just a way to protect human rights domestically and to talk Myanmar person to Myanmar person about protecting human rights. These are stories that everybody in the world is interested in. Everybody in the world is interested in Myanmar. And for the past half century, we haven't heard the real stories that are coming out of Myanmar. And the documentary tradition is a fantastic way for people in Myanmar to tell the whole world about their stories. So we're very proud to participate in that too.
Allow me to go back to the history when Canada and Myanmar is concerned. That goes back to even Burma achieved independence.
Yes,
before
actually even farther back.
Yeah, farther back.
Yeah.
There were Canadian soldiers
Yep.
in the Allied forces who were fighting against the Japanese occupation in Burma. Can you recall some such historic ties that the two countries have?
Yeah. So again, this I mentioned that a lot of people in Myanmar think of Canada as this very distant, different country that maybe is a pleasant place but has no connection or similarity to Myanmar. But actually, Rangoon, 100 years ago, Rangoon was one of the most cosmopolitan cities in Asia. And we have very interesting photographs of board of directors meetings of Canadian companies here 100 years ago. Sun Life was another insurance company that had an office in Rangoon, old Rangoon, more than 100 years ago. So there are these actually commercial ties that go back a very long way. As you said, there was substantial Canadian participation in the in the Air Force mostly, that drove the Axis troops, the Japanese troops, out of Myanmar in 1944-45. And there are very many Canadians who are buried in the Commonwealth War cemeteries here, in particular, Taukchant, particularly in Taukchant. And then in the 60s and 70s with the Colombo Plan and an era where Canada was very active here. Many people know about CIDA, the Canadian International Development Agency. CIDA funding built the Yangon Children's Hospital. If you go to the Yangon Children's Hospital, not the Yankin branch, but the old building of the Yangon Children's Hospital, the original building, you'll see on the cornerstone a little red maple leaf. And that was a token sign that it was built with Canadian assistance and Canadian technology. And that's an area that we'd really like to restart, this cooperation on health, because health is another area where we think Canada has a lot to share. We have outstanding hospitals and research, but maybe more importantly, outstanding public health, which is something that a developing country like Myanmar needs. So, as I said, then after that there was this quarter century of kind of a freeze. And so a lot of the ties between Canada and Burma were they disintegrated. No trade, as we talked about, no investment, there was no development cooperation. It was very hard to get a visa to go to Canada, so there were very few Burmese tourists or foreign students, very few immigrants comparatively in Canada, a country with a very large, diverse immigrant population. And of course, no high-level ties and no embassy here. So really the relationship between Canada and Myanmar was down to nothing. So, I always say this embassy is kind of like a startup. There was, there was pretty much nothing here before, but just like Myanmar, Myanmar understands in many sectors there's a benefit to arriving late. You can kind of think things through and maybe move more quickly when you're a late starter, and that's what we hope we're going to be doing. That We're a bit of a late starter here. We've only been here for a couple of years, but we really want to make up for lost time. We want to really rebuild that relationship between Canada and Myanmar. And as I said, we've started with a lot of assistance to grassroots organizations. Now we have more high-level visits. You know, we've had, this is the third ministerial visit we've had. Development cooperation. We've opened a visa application center in Prime Hill, which is over by you know, the old the embassy district. And you know, we have a kind of the relationship is becoming broader and more mature. And I really hope that especially as trade takes off and development cooperation, there'll be more dollars, more, not just goodwill, but also money behind the relationship.
Canada has been consistently supporting the democracy movement in Burma, Myanmar for all these years, more than 2 decades. And one of the things that Canada did for Burma, Myanmar was allowing the Burmese democracy activists or exile community to resettle in Canada. And many of them, I'm aware that they have been doing very well in Canada. Many of them are like blue-collar workers in the companies. And what is the role they can play now, in your opinion? Now, Myanmar has a space, or Myanmar is transitioning to a democracy.
Well, okay, let's look at it from 2 ways. Let's look at it from the Canadian, what can they do for Canada and what can they do for Myanmar? I think Canada really views its multi-cultural, multi-ethnic makeup as a real asset. So, you know, there are many Chinese Canadians, Indian Canadians, Portuguese Canadians, Italian Canadians, and they very often act as a bridge between the 2 countries. It's not something that's organized by the government or anything like that, but it just happens naturally. I believe James Mint-Sway, who's a Burmese-Canadian author, a historian, he said they're in a, immigrants, wherever they come from, they know they're in a very awkward position because they have 2 loves. They're in love with their country of their birth and the country that they adopted, and it's somehow just like being in love with 2 people might be a little bit awkward situation that. It's similar, but on the other hand, the 2 of them those 2 loves can coexist very well. So, these people can act as a bridge, and for Canada, they've been a tremendous asset for things like, business, facilitating international business, and just a general international understanding. I think for Myanmar, our hope is that we're happy to see Canadians coming back here, Canadians with maybe entrepreneurial expertise, Burmese Canadians with capital, and there are a lot of Burmese Canadians who are very interested in making a contribution, for example, as maybe as volunteers or as to try to make a contribution to things like human rights or peace and so on. So I think immigrants are people with they have a really unique worldview and really unique skills.
Your new Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, he's a young leader, and can we expect his visit to Myanmar for the Myanmar people, especially young people, to get inspired to very soon?
There's no plans right now. I mean, I would love to have him visit here. We're a little bit exhausted now with since our own minister just left today, but that would be fantastic. But I think you mentioned the youth. Prime Minister Trudeau also kept one cabinet post for himself, which was Minister of Youth. He is, very, very concerned with gender equality, but also with youth issues. And I think he's really been inspiring to get Canadian youth interested in politics, not necessarily just as his followers, but to be more interested in issues, the issues that are going to affect them now, but also in 20 years, 40 years. So I think he's been a tremendously positive force in that sense. And he's also been very good publicity for Canada, because Canada is a country that's often seen as, maybe a very successful country, but a little bit boring, right? Compared to maybe its neighbor. But I think Trudeau has brought a little bit of excitement to the image of Canada. So
as a young leader.
as a young leader with a vision and, frankly, a lot of charisma as well, and an ability to talk directly to citizens in a very genuine way.
Since you opened an embassy here to a little bit more than 2 years ago, I have seen very active use of social media by the embassy, especially Facebook.
Yes.
Why?
Yes.
Well, what do you think of the social media in Myanmar?
Okay, well, I mean, I came here from Beijing, and so I was in charge of the public diplomacy in Beijing, and so we made tremendous use of social media there. Very different environment, because there, part of it was that there was not as much freedom to do events in real space, so we went to a virtual space to get our messages out.
But Facebook was banned.
We used Weibo, the Chinese version.
Yeah.
So here it's a little bit different. I think it also goes back to what I just said about the virtues of being a latecomer. We came here and we realized, okay, we're late. We're much smaller than, I don't want to mention countries, but other countries that we might want to measure ourselves against. So we thought, we're latecomers. We don't have the same kind of assets on the ground. We had to think, like, how can we make an impact? How can we get our message across? And that forced us to think about, instead of the traditional diplomatic tools, to really put a lot of our thought and emphasis on Facebook, particularly here. Because, again, it's a way to really engage directly with the population of Myanmar, and in particularly with young people. So, I could go and I could make a speech at a school or something to 50 people, or we can put something on Facebook and we reach, as of today, close to 200,000 people. And I think our approach on Facebook has been to be very conversational, informal, in a way that reflects what we see as our country, where we want to be friendly. We want to talk to people in Myanmar on equal terms. We want an exchange. We want to give a bit of information about Canada, about things that we're doing here, also help people here understand a little bit better Canada's priorities, Canada's outlook, but we do it in a very conversational way, and we hope it's sort of fun as well. We don't want it to be a boring government propaganda tool. We want it to be very engaging and entertaining.
We have an issue of the negative side of the social media in the country, especially at times of crisis, at times of tensions.
Yes.
What do you think of that? How Myanmar could sort of handle it the best way possible?
You know what I find on social media, there's good and bad in every new discovery, right? Every broadcast medium, every tool has its good and its bad side. I find in a lot of cases, actually, the community kind of polices itself. There will be a discussion on social media, and it'll burn itself out or be resolved in some way. You're talking about attention with things like hate speech or incitement to violence. I think the issue here is that we have to be very careful that we don't use fear of hate speech as maybe kind of a wedge that will start closing down space for freedom of expression. We have to be very cognizant of the fact that freedom of expression is in itself a way to discuss issues, and I'm quite convinced that tolerance and mutual respect are things that are quite reasonable and logical, and with a free discussion, most people will come to support them. On the other hand, I think if there's actual incitement to violence, that has to be dealt with. That has to be dealt with in with the law, and it's just drawing that kind of fine line. We've been very fortunate here that we haven't experienced much of that on our own Facebook pages. We never delete negative. Have we ever deleted? I don't think we've ever deleted any negative comments, because again, we want, if you want to post on our Facebook page, you don't like our government policy, that's fine. We leave that up. That's, you're free to speak, and it's great for us to get that feedback, right? Because when you're a diplomat, people are very polite to you, very nice and polite. But we want to hear it's interesting to hear people's real opinions. So I should have said that was the other reason why we wanted to be active on social media, is that it's not just a broadcast medium for us. One of our other problems was, because of this long period where we had very little contact, I think Canadians, even Canadian diplomats or Canadians in the Foreign Service didn't have a very good understanding of what people in Myanmar are thinking. And I think social media, in a way, allows you to read people's minds, right? It's a way to read the mind of the community, because people say on social media exactly what they're thinking. If there's no politeness, people in Myanmar are they'll never say impolite or awkward things to a gray-haired foreigner, right? So it's very useful for us to listen very, very carefully to social media to find out what people think about Canada and all kinds of other issues. So we really value social media. And follow us on Facebook, facebook.com, Canada Yangon.
Yeah. We have been having the peace negotiations in the last 4 or 5 years in the country. Some results, but still fightings and tensions in some areas are going on. What do you think of the peace process in Myanmar? What Canada can do, or is there any role that you can do in the peace process?
Right. The peace process will certainly be, it has to be managed by the Burmese people themselves. We don't. Foreigners aren't going to come in and solve your problems, and I'm sure Myanmar people don't want foreigners to come in and solve their problems. So just as in other areas, just as in development cooperation or cooperation on human rights, we want to respond to the real needs of Myanmar people. We don't want to come in and tell you how to fix things. Up to now, we've played a very peripheral role, a very minor role in the peace process. I've talked about Canadian experience in federalism. We have less experience in things like peace process, speaking from our own experience in our own country. But we hope that we can play a role, for example, in the process of helping participants in the peace process better understand how this process has worked successfully or unsuccessfully in other countries. That's an area where possibly we could fund training, we could fund exchange of experiences, something like that. But we'll be playing a very small role, and only at the invitation of Myanmar people.